When I was a little boy in England, growing up in London, I was always at the bottom of the class and was thought to be very slow. I remember one day the headmaster came to see my parents after school when I think I was about 9 and said there was nothing they could do for me and that I should be taken out of school. And my mother took me to the local butcher shop down the road and tried to apprentice me to the butchers, big hefty guys with arms like legs of a lamb. And they took one look at me and didn't want me, quite rightly. Then my family emigrated to Brisbane, Australia, and I was still at the bottom of the class.
I travelled to a city made of heat, where brown snakes slithered past a pawpaw tree. Our new house stood on stilts and creaked at night, and thunder took the place of history.
It's lucky Kevin Hart wasn't a big, hefty lad. He may have made a fine butcher, but the world of poetry would have lost a very fine voice. Welcome to Encounter on ABC Radio National. I'm Carmel Howard.
And then one day, our first class in algebra, I remember looking at the board and seeing a simple algebraic formula, and it was as though some rusted window inside me just sprung open. And I understood exactly what was going on in the algebraic formula. And I looked around me and saw the classroom, my teacher, my friends, all of which was very familiar to me, as though it was completely new, as though I'd never seen it before. And then over the coming weeks, when we had exams, to my surprise and to the astonishment of my parents, I went from being at the bottom of the class to the top of the class. And that was an experience I've never fully been able to understand. And I sometimes worry that maybe that window will just spring shut one day.
Where brown snakes slithered past a pawpaw tree, I sat and wrote my future in a daze. Huge thunder took the place of history, and yet a no uncoiled within each yes.
It doesn't seem as if that window of illumination is shutting on Kevin Hart anytime soon. The renowned American critic Harold Bloom has called him the most outstanding Australian poet of his generation and one of the major living poets in the English language. Kevin Hart is also an internationally recognised philosopher, theologian and literary critic. He's currently the Edwin B. Carl Professor of Christian Studies and Chair of the Religious Studies Department at the University of Virginia, where he holds courtesy professorships in the departments of English and French. He also holds the Erin Darcy Chair in Philosophy at the Australian Catholic University. But back to Kevin and that sense of a rusted window springing up in the classroom of Brisbane's Oxley State High School many years ago. What else blew through after algebra class?
It was a complete opening of everything that I am. Shortly after that experience, although I had no ability in mathematics, I started reading quite difficult mathematics books, and I started doing algebra and geometry by myself, and I worked on several theorems and sent them to the head of department at the local university, the University of Queensland. I started to write poems. I started to go out with a girl. Everything happened within a few dizzy weeks. About that time, I had a very good English teacher called John McGrath who did something which would probably be almost illegal today. He made his students learn poems by heart. So I had to learn for homework a poem by Shelley, Ozymandias. And I thought it was wonderful. It utterly ravished me. And over the coming weeks, I wrote a lot of poor imitation Shelley and saved up my pocket money and worked at a car wash in order to buy a volume of Shelley and read all of him and was intoxicated by Shelley, and thereafter read Hopkins and T.S. Eliot and couldn't be separated from these books, while all the time being preoccupied by mathematics.
I sat and wrote my future in a daze, and though the sun kept hammering my head, and though a no uncoiled within each yes, I listened hard for what is left unsaid.
Beneath the earthy, sensual surface of Kevin Hart's poetry, there always rides something that's left unsaid, something vast and mysterious, an invisible, deeper world of the spirit. It was also around that heady age of 13 that Hart began his spiritual search. It was a search he initiated himself, having come from a family with no particular interest in religion.
It was about that time I went to the local Southern Baptist church, in part because it was local and because I knew an American boy in my class who went there. And I found the hymns very, very moving, hymns of such longing and passion. And I found a kind of sublime simplicity in the service and in the prayers, which I found very moving. It served a purpose for a long time, but this was the age of the Vietnam War, and it seemed to me after a while that there was a conflation of Republican politics and Christianity. And my version of Christianity, as I was starting to form it at the time, was very different from that. And so in the end, I stopped going there.
It was the sound of darkness, Mother said, but still I heard you calling in the night. It was our old poinsettia, straight from hell, its full moon perfume wafting through the house. Or fine mosquitoes rising from the river just coiling in the dark there down the road. It was that sound of water and the trees that somehow found a way into my sleep. At night, between poinsettia and the river, something of me walked round and round and round near that black water with its snags and snakes and long, low sounds that keep the grass alive. And you were there as well, a touch away, always about to pull the darkness back. And there were always branches rustling hard and tall reeds bending, never any wind.
When I was in my early 20s, I converted to Catholicism after a long period of searching. What I think drew me to the Catholic Church is that in Catholicism, prayer suffuses all of one's life by virtue of the sacraments. Prayer is not something which occurs just on Sunday. It doesn't occur only at particular moments of intensity or by particular conventions. One's whole life is given up to prayer in many, many modes. And so everything to do with the faith is trying to put you in relationship with God and trying to make that relationship grow deeper and more mature.
I've heard you say that you're interested in the mystical strain in Catholicism. I wonder if you could explain why that mystical strain attracts you.
Catholicism is the big house of Christianity. It's got many, many rooms in it. And I've always been attracted to the rooms which are to do with prayer. The mystical strain is the strain whereby the whole day can be given over to prayer through what we call lectio divina, prayerful reading of scripture, through practice of meditation, of when one uses the imagination and the intellect with respect to images, and then finally, and most difficult of all, contemplation, where one empties the mind of all images and all ideas, all concepts, in order to be completely attentive to God. What you find, I think, in this mystical strain of Catholicism is that you're put in relationship with God, and you have many opportunities not only of talking with God in petitionary prayer, but also of listening to God, being attentive to God as happens in contemplation.
Show me the truth, but not in those loose wrappings of the wind, or covered by the little stream of words that warms old lies. Show it to me in blossoms as they prey on rain-black boughs of dogwood down our street, that petal prayer of white and pink, that slows the blood and has the day peel off its shining skin and brings bee angels closer just to smell what prayer is.
Many of Kevin Hart's poems are concerned with prayer, and many take the title Prayer. But while these poems stretch out towards the divine, they never try to grasp God. As Hart suggests in his early poem Master of Energy and Silence, God is beyond reach of language. It's an approach that's in keeping with the tradition of negative theology.
The whole tradition in the West and in the East has been that there are two threads in theology. There's cataphatic or positive theology, in which God the Son is sent by the Father in and through the Spirit, and hence we have revelation and Scripture. And then there is apophatic or negative theology, which is to do with how we are to speak about God, that we begin from what revelation gives us, but we question the predications that we make of God, so that when we say God is good, for example, we don't mean God is good in the way that chocolate is good or wine is good, nor do we mean it in the sense in which something might be a good action. Obviously, divine goodness transcends all of these things. So we question the predications and we pass from acts of knowing to acts of unknowing, so that our speech is taken away from us and we're less and less concerned with saying things about God than an intimacy, a silent intimacy with God.
In Kevin Hart's book, The Trespass of the Sign, Deconstruction, Theology and Philosophy, written in 1989, he brings negative theology into conversation with Jacques Derrida's concept of deconstruction by suggesting that negative theology is in fact a mode of deconstruction.
Negative theology shows us that our discourse as Christians, our theological discourse and even our prayers, are constructions using finite language, and it allows us to glimpse the ways in which we construct that discourse. Now, the modern discourse that points out how we examine how discourse is constructed is called deconstruction, as Jacques Derrida calls it. It's a mode of phenomenology. The very word deconstruction comes from Luther in his Heidelberg Disputation. Martin Heidegger translated it from the Latin into German, and then Derrida translated it from the German into the French. And what Luther was quoting is St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 1:19, "I shall destroy the wisdom of the wise." And there Paul is actually quoting Isaiah 29:14, "I shall destroy the wisdom of the wise." Namely, I shall not rely upon the wisdom of human beings, even of priests, even of popes, even of theologians, in talking about God. The God himself is much greater than these things and breaks through all systems. I think that the great early fathers of the Church, Gregory of Nyssa for one, Pseudo-Denis the Areopagite for another, were tuned to this in their writings, and they make us see that everything we say about God is only very partial, only constructed, and that what counts is not the statements we make about God, but the intimacy of the relationship that we have with God.
There is a man who will not let me sleep. Each night he comes and trembles by my side. He cannot be touched, yet wind disturbs his hair. He cannot touch, yet his shadow covers me. Each night he comes and trembles by my side. I reach towards him, and he fades like day. He cannot touch, yet his shadow covers me. I hide within myself, and he draws close.
Hart's early poem, The Companion, which we've just heard, gives voice to a mysterious intimacy with the divine. In his more recent poetry, Hart addresses God as Dark One, as he explains.
This came to me quite naturally one day when I was writing a poem. There seems to be something poetically that doesn't work or is limiting when you call God God in a poem. When I tried to be honest with myself in my relationship with God, Christ is, on the one hand, completely dark. He's transcendent and unknowable. On the other hand, he is completely immanent and completely knowable as Jesus. Our tradition speaks of him in both ways, as transcendent, but also as a lover who comes to us. And the two words Dark One seem to me to contain both things, the transcendence and otherness of Christ on the one hand, but also like a kind of dark lover who comes to us. And I wanted to keep that ambiguity.
Dark one, it is the summer now. The evenings feel beneath my shirt, and it is good. The trees, they sway a little when they get high, and higher still the nests and stars are quiet. And I am left alone with you inside those wild electric wires out there, and playing with my half-unbuttoned shirt, and growing in those shady leaves.
Kevin Hart's poetry often blurs the lines between romantic and religious longing, with erotic love becoming an allegory for divine union. It's a way of speaking that stems back to the Hebrew Bible and the Christian mystical tradition.
It comes to us from the Song of Songs, the Canticle, which is a series of Hebrew love poems which were allegorized by the Jewish community and by the early church to be of the soul's longing for God. Divine love, agape, is self-sacrificing love, which sounds difficult, as it is, and not very attractive. If the best image we have of love is of a man who's been tortured and hung upon a cross to die an excruciating death, this is something that human beings find very, very hard to understand as love. But it is the highest Christian image of love. But in the path to God, the path which leads to greater intimacy with God, as Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, and many others have pointed out, that agape suddenly flips into eros. And the best way of understanding God's love for us is of the kind of intimate love that men and women share.
2 yellow tulips in a bottle that held red wine last night. Small islands of fermenting green played samba in your sleep. I woke up to admire the way your blouse fell on my clock. I want to love you all the day with the lightness of blossom. I want to love you all the night with the density of hammers. Just sometimes when she speaks across the table, content with claret, ham and cheese, her voice goes deep, and at that moment and no other she could take my soul. And sometimes when she tears a hunk of bread and soaks it in the olive oil, she does not speak, and at that moment, and no other, she could take my soul. I only want to live forever in your kiss, and let my hand slip down your thighs. I only want your eyes and breasts to say my name, and your light hand undo my belt. I like to drench my face in your thick hair, and lick where neck and shoulder meet. There is a fine grey hair I love near your left lobe. Gods captured by a hair, exclaimed my patron saint, my patron poet too. And I know how he feels.
The kind of love that God has for us, I think, is of an infinite longing for union. And the kind of love that God wants us to have for him, I think, is of this also endless longing. Now, in eros, we lose ourselves. I think erotic love transforms us, but it does so only momentarily. It has to be embedded in something much longer, a much bigger narrative called marriage or a durable relationship or something like that. In the relationship that we have with God, most of that relationship, I think, is not characterized by the erotic. It's only in the most intense moments of it that we can understand that what God wants with us, I think, is a union which is so intimate. The best image that we have as mortal finite creatures is erotic love, is marriage. And so it's a momentary image that we can have for the life that God ultimately wants with us.
Come back to me. The road is waiting quietly outside your door. The wind is blowing the leaves this way. It is late afternoon, the best time for making love. Half the world is sleeping now. No longer sad, the violins fit into their velvet cases, and lovers there must do without their eyes. Come back. I want to tell you how all of the things I only half believed before are true. I want to find that part of you I never touched and make it blossom. I want the clock to count the hours as seconds until your sorrow is forgotten. Come back. Don't watch the sunlight lazing on the street. Don't wait for fruit to grow without a rind. You know the way. The heat that's in the flesh by afternoon, the taste of salt, the face that fits into your eyes. I want to know again what it's like to breathe your words. I want to know once more how it feels to be peeled and eaten whole, time after time.
You're with Encounter on ABC Radio National. I'm Carmel Howard, and we're hearing this week from the Australian poet, philosopher and theologian Kevin Hart. As we've heard so far, Hart's poetry explores intimacy from many angles. In poems like The Room, he addresses the deepest reaches of the self, which can't be offered directly to consciousness. For Hart, the deep self is a presence that's beyond representation, like a closed room at the centre of a house.
It is my house, and yet one room is locked. The dark has taken root on all four walls. It is a room where knots stare out from wood, a room that turns its back on the whole house. At night, I hear the crickets list their griefs and let an ancient peace come into me. Sleep intercepts my prayer, and in the dark, the house turns slowly round its one closed room.
When we talk about transcendence, there's often two things that are going on. There's that which is above or beyond phenomena, as we imagine God to be. And there's also that which is beneath or prior to phenomena, the roots of language, as you find in Heidegger and Wittgenstein and others. And both of these things are equally mysterious, it seems to me. Now, in a poem like The Room, it's concerned with something dark or secret or mysterious in our own lives, that our lives turn around that, a secret that we can't even explain to ourselves, a mystery that we can't present to our intellect and decode it, something which is so deep within us that we can't articulate it, but nor can we live without it. So there's always one room in our house, in our lives, which is completely closed to us.
Are you suggesting something sort of like the unconscious, or...?
The unconscious could be a figure for it, but it's only one figure. I think for most of us, there's something in our lives which is either secret or mysterious that we can't articulate, and it will be different for each one of us. In the Jewish tradition, people talk about a secret proper name, which is inscribed in us that we can't actually articulate. In the Christian tradition, we often talk about the Imago Dei, the image of God which is inscribed upon the soul, that we can't pronounce. So, in a sense, all of our lives turn endlessly around this unspeakable word that we keep trying to find other words for. Every poem that I write is, in a sense, trying to find adequate words for this unspeakable word around which my entire life turns. I was in Melbourne, about to go out to dinner one evening, and the phone went, and it was a man with a fairly thick Spanish accent, and he told me he'd just arrived in Adelaide, I think it was, from Chile, where he'd been in prison, in solitary confinement, and tortured daily. And he said that before he was taken into prison, the local bishop had him and a number of people in the group he was with learned some of my poems in Spanish translation. And I had no idea that my poems had been translated into Spanish. And he said that while he was being tortured each day, he would recite The Room. And he said, that experience of reciting your poem kept me sane while I was being tortured. And I wanted to tell you this and thank you. And then he hung up.
The mystery of language and its effects runs deep in Kevin Hart's poetry. For Hart, a contemporary religious poetry, to be defined as such, must question any mode of representation, including language. The limits of language become especially important in Hart's poetry of counter-experience. But first, what is counter-experience?
This is an expression, Jean-Luc Marion's, the French phenomenologist, and I used that expression and various others like it in some of my work as well. When we talk of experience, we talk of experiencing things which are objects. Counter-experience is to do with our experience of things which are not objective. They don't have the quality of objects. These are phenomena, but they don't take the form of objects, like revelation or the sublime, for example. Now, when we are faced with the sublime or revelation, we can't process it in the way that we can when we're perceiving an object. And this is sometimes very frustrating, and sometimes it's exhilarating. You get the two different modalities. And in poetry, often enough, we're talking about phenomena which are not objects. We're talking about sublime experiences. And so a lot of poetry, not all of it, but a lot of romantic and post-romantic poetry in particular, is concerned with counter-experience.
Driving east in the darkness between two stars or between two thoughts, you reach the greatest ocean, that cold expanse the rain can never net. And driving east, you are a child again. The web of names is brushed aside from things. The ocean's name is quietly washed away, revealing the thing itself, an energy, an elemental life flashing in starlight. No word can shrink it down to fit the mind. It is already there, between two thoughts, the darkness in which you travel and arrive, the nameless one, the surname of all things. The ocean slowly rocks from side to side, a child itself, asleep in its bed of rocks, no parent there to wake it from a dream, to draw the ancient gods between the stars. You stand upon the cliff, no longer cold, and you are weightless, back before the thrust and rush of birth when beards of blood are grown. Or outside time, as though you had just died to birth and death, no name to hide behind, no name to splay the world or burn it whole. The ocean quietly moves within your ear and flashes in your eyes. The silent place outside the world we know is here and now. Between two thoughts, a child that does not grow, a silence undressing words, a nameless love.
In Hart's poem, Facing the Pacific at Night, which we've just heard, the speaker's senses are overrun by counter-experience. It's a vast, mystical moment, described in terms of silence, darkness and longing, terms that recall the negative theology Hart spoke of earlier. Facing the Pacific at Night seems to suggest that everything we know depends on our ability to name it. But these names simply point to a silent, dark grandeur that goes on beneath the noise of the world. In Hart's poem, Yes, the idea of counter-experience comes up again, but this time it appears lightly, as moments of radiance that are somehow strangely affirming.
It happens once or twice. Oh yes, it happens on days that go astray, warm days when light is rich and hours are long. It happens when time is inside out a little, when you see those flakes of cloud float up as if released from the snowy lawn, and those red cedar leaves are still. Oh yes, it happens, although they cannot say exactly so, although we cannot tell them how, although it happens. just once or twice. But yes. Oh, yes.
It's concerned with those strange moments of otherness that seem to break in to our ordinary lives. It happens on days that go astray, I say, or when time is inside out a little. I think these are quite common experiences or counter-experiences when something seems imbricated in an ordinary day that we can't quite identify, although there's been a sudden change of level of our experience. And in the poem itself, it doesn't say what is being affirmed, it just affirms that kind of counter-experience. I think what happens in a religious life is that we have those experiences of affirmation, and the one starts to live a Christian life or a Jewish life or a Muslim life or a Buddhist life by affirming that affirmation each day. Each day you say yes to that yes. So the life of being a Christian, for example, is always a life of double affirmation, that you each day say yes to those counter-experiences of saying yes, even when you're not experiencing them at that time. You're remaining loyal to that experience. So in marriage, for example, you say yes on the day you get married, I do, but each day you implicitly, if not explicitly, also say yes. By every act that one performs in a marriage, one is saying yes. Making a cup of coffee for one's wife or husband is a form of saying yes to the marriage vow, that one is continuing the marriage by affirming it in one's deeds. And exactly the same in the religious life. If the religious life, as I think it does, has this structure of double affirmation, it means that even in periods of dryness, you are still affirming the fundamental yes, the fundamental affirmation of God. Anselm says, quite rightly, that faith is always in quest of understanding, that we're always trying to understand what it means to have faith in God. And our understanding, by the same token, as Augustine says, is always in quest of faith. We don't always possess faith in the sense of having a clear embodiment of something to hang on to. The relationship between the intellect and faith is a very curious one. Sometimes the intellect can point us to faith, sometimes the intellect can stand in the way of faith. Sometimes, as St. John of the Cross points out, we have to darken or blind the intellect in order to have faith. The relationship we have with God is not the same over a life. Sometimes, as with human relationships, it goes through bad patches, and sometimes it becomes very intense. It is a terrifying thing to have a relationship with one's Creator, to spend one's life so that one is trying to converge with one's Creator seems an extraordinarily difficult and sublime thing. But at the same time, it's extremely simple. One of the things which perpetually amazes me is that at any moment of any day, anyone who is alive can talk with the Creator of the cosmos. But then when we try to reflect on it, when we try to do theology, whether we're theologians or ordinary folks who would like to think about God, it's almost impossible. How can you think about God who is absolutely singular, who is transcendent, who escapes all of our mode of thought? As soon as we try to write the simplest sentence about God, we find ourselves in endless perplexities. But when we stop trying to write about God and talk with God, God is there, and we can talk with God. This paradox, it seems to me, is at the heart of the Christian life, and not just the Christian life, the religious life. And it's something we never can overcome.
And when you attempt to speak in your prayer poems, is there anything that you experience or learn in the process of that attempt?
I think that every prayer is thrown upon the void. It's always an experiment. Prayer is sublimely easy because we can talk to God, but a lot of what's involved in prayer, I think, is overhearing ourselves talk to God. Every prayer involves a thoroughgoing critique of the person who is praying. So whether one is saying a prayer or writing a poem, which is a prayer, it always is concerned with a moment of critique, of exposing the poverty of one's ability to pray and exposing the vacuity of what one prays for.
Prayer, that terrible, strange thing, a soul unclenching something fierce to play hide-and-go-seek, or taking the first step again into a boat without oars, with evening falling fast, or leaping from a cliff, no one around, and hoping to be gripped halfway down.
Kevin Hart's poems, like his prayers, have an attitude of exposure and risk. As we've heard so far, they grapple with the great unpresentables: God, the deep self, counter-experience. His poems also find words for the experiences of ageing and death. As he ventures in his early poem, The Old, written in his 20s, someone old will be inside your flesh not long from now. I know the one who wants me. Sometimes I think I know his thoughts. He will know me very well.
I think in society today we have almost completely medicalized death. We're so scared of death that we want doctors to do the best they can to medicate us so we don't feel pain. No one dies at home anymore. Very few people, I think, in terminal illnesses actually have an opportunity to confront their death. We experience death in medical terms. We don't experience death as a mystery. I think death is not simply the last few moments of life. Death is something that runs throughout the whole of life. Each of our moments is not only the possibility of affirmation, but it's also we're saying farewell at each moment to something. So unless we form some kind of adequate relationship to death, we're never going to live properly. And if we think of it purely as a medical thing, we have reduced life. We should think of it as some sort of mystery in which we can participate in now, not something to be pushed off to one side till the last moments.
My death, like the sun, I cannot bear to face it. I say that it has nothing to do with me, exists outside of me, a silence, a darkness, when everything is done. Yet even now, I feel it deep within me, closer than my breathing, moving within me, slow as my blood, measuring me with all I care to do. A shadow I follow, or that follows me, and leads me to my center, not my edge.
I wonder if you could also explain a little about the poems that you've written for your friend David Campbell. You have said that you've had a sense since his death, which was a long time ago now, a sense of your friendship somehow continuing, and I was wondering whether that was something that had happened in the act of poeticising his death.
David Campbell is a great poet, and he was a very good friend to me when he was alive, and he passed away in 1979, and it was a huge loss. I've never overcome that loss. I've had experiences over the years that are very difficult to verbalize of David, as it were, looking out for me, watching over me, drawing close to me, and they've been profoundly moving. And I've written now several poems about David, and it's strange to say that it's as though our relationship has become richer since he's died than it could have been when he was alive. I was young, very young, and he was getting old. And I have the feeling in writing the poems that the relationship gets richer and more varied, as though I'm talking with him and learning from him still. It's a very peculiar experience, I must say.
I want you to come back to me as you once were when I was 20, sad and knowing nothing much, and summer's light was thick, the juice of nectarines, and talk came quickly like the second glass of wine. And you were young then too, or so it seems to me as I creep up dark stairs to be the age you were. And still I sometimes think that I might somehow turn a corner, find you slouching there, and all our days will be distilled into a lunch that goes astray. And we will gossip some, then swap new books of verse, and you will slowly pull your gentle, wicked smile, and somehow find more wine, and words will swarm like bees.
Whether speaking about loved ones or God, Kevin Hart's poetry has long traced the movements of intimate relationships and the pain of absence. In his latest collection, Mourning Knowledge, he grieves the passing of his father, who died in Brisbane in 2009. In poem after poem, there's a sense of him searching out his father's life and death, and of being haunted, surprised, and confounded again and again.
My father gave me my first tie when I was all too young. Oh, long and thin and black it was, and I climbed up a rung. "I'll wear it at your funeral, Dad," I said, absorbed with black. My father grew a foot too tall. "Maybe I'll take it back." He knotted it behind my neck, and I shot up an inch. I looked into a mirror, hard, and saw my father flinch. When going through my father's things, stained medals, bric-a-brac, I found that tie a week too late. Maybe I'll take it back.
So far, at least, the writing of the poems has been an act of mourning. I knew my father was going to die. I wrote about anticipating his death, particularly in the poem called Dark Bird. And when he died, a very easy death, almost a happy death, one could say, it was very traumatic, and I haven't recovered from it, and I can't imagine that I shall. We were very close, and I've had no sense of anything continuing. I knew when he died, when I was in Charlottesville, I was sitting at my desk in my office, and I went suddenly completely cold. And then a few minutes later, the phone went, and my wife phoned and said my father had passed away just a few minutes ago. It was as though his spirit went directly through me and chilled me to the bone. And since then, I've just felt an utter void.
What do you want with me today, Dark Bird? Why are you flying low beneath that branch? I know your shadow. You were long since gone, my killdeer, rough-winged swallow, mourning dove. Death plays its flute with all your bones, Dark Bird. You brood within my nest of breath, Dark Bird. Your razor claw is in my eye, Dark Bird. Sweet finches are in blossom here, Dark Bird. My father's dying now, Dark Bird, you know. He feels your shadow now, Dark Bird, you know. His bones are hollow now, Dark Bird, you know. He's turned to feathers now, Dark Bird, you know. Take to another land, Dark Bird, fly now. Go snap sweet sunflower souls, Dark Bird, fly now. 1,000 deaths await you there, Dark Bird. Fly fast, Dark Bird, fly fast, fly past, Dark Bird.
I think poetry can be a kind of secular way in which people can be led to approach the difficult parts of their life, where there's been loss, where there's sadness of a deep kind. If poetry can help people to be more at ease in expressing even to themselves a lot of the darkness and pain of ordinary human existence, then it's serving some kind of cultural role, perhaps more than a cultural role, perhaps it is serving something of a spiritual role. The kind of poetry I write, lyric poetry, I think is really concerned with intimacy with mystery. That needn't be religious mystery. There are mysteries to do with everyday life. Often poetry, especially the sort of poetry I write, is concerned with looking at the borders between the sensual and the spiritual and seeing them as divided, equivocal, that mystery somehow can break into the ordinary. And we read poetry, I think, in part to gain a sense of that intimacy with things that we can't understand, that are unable to be understood, but that buoy up our lives. Poems which draw us close to prayer are, I think, doing more than that. I think poetry has started to take on a supplementary role of prayer for some people. The churches, I think, including my own, are terrible at teaching people how to pray. It may be that we need to learn from the ground up as religious people, whether Christian or not, how to pray.
The Stone's Prayer. Father, I praise you for the wideness of this your earth, and for the sky arched forever over me, for the sharp rain and the scraping wind that have carved me from the mountain and made me smooth as a child's face. Accept my praise for my color, a starless night, that my width is that between the first 2 stars of evening reflected in the water, that my quartz flashes like lightning and reflects the glory of your creation, that you have seen fit to place me near a stream and thus to contemplate the passing of time. For all that is around me I sing your praise, for the fierce concentration of ants, their laws, for all that they tell me about you. Keep me, I pray, whole, unlike the terrible dust and pieces of bone cast about in the wind's great breath, unlike men who must suffer change, their endless footprints deep as graves. Keep me in truth, in solitude, until the day when you will burst into my heavy soul, and I will shout your name.
And that was The Stone's Prayer by Kevin Hart, poet, philosopher, theologian, and this week's guest on ABC Radio National's Encounter program. My thanks to Kevin Hart. Thanks also to Eugene Gilfeder, who read from Kevin Hart's new collection of poetry, Mourning Knowledge, published by the University of Notre Dame Press. He also read from Young Rain, published by Giramondo, and Flame Tree, published by Paperbark Press. More details for this Encounter program are available at our website. Technical production this week was by Peter McMurray, and I'm Carmel Howard.